Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of Ask GN. As always, if you have questions, you can leave them in the comment section below, or if you're a Patreon backer, you can go to patreon.com/gamersnexus, tell us that directly, and then join our Discord, where we have an Ask GN Discord for Patreon backers. So this week, we've got a couple of topics. One, the opening topic is on Noctua's fans, the thing that blew up on Build-A-PC. And then we'll be getting into the viewer and reader questions. Before getting to that, we have a brand new shirt design. So that's this one right here. This is on the GN store. You can go to gamersnexus.squarespace.com to grab one of those. We have them in teal and in gray with cotton and tri-blend. And they were kind of debuted on our first stream, which happened last night as of filming. So that'll be actually last night for you as well. So pretty cool stuff. We're going to do more streams in the future. I don't have a schedule for you. It's just kind of going to be when I want to take something apart like this. And we'll go from there. We'll try to announce it on Twitter, but that's about it. All right, so for the episode, let's open with Noctua. The Build-A-PC thread that blew up, if you didn't see it, was basically that there are manufacturing differences between the fans made in China and the fans made in Taiwan by Noctua. So the AF-14s, I think, were the ones that were discussed there, and theoretically would also apply to the 120mm fans. So I have some thoughts on this. We are actually getting a couple sets of these fans in from China and Taiwan to test. I will tell you right now what my kind of hypothesis is leading into it from an industry standpoint, and then we'll see if the testing disproves any of it. So first of all, the differences pointed out in the Reddit thread were primarily color. There's a slight color variation between the standard ugly Noctua fan and the slightly different ugly Noctua fan between the China and the Taiwan factories. And then beyond that, there were some differences pointed out in the what would consist of your output from the tooling or the mold. And those were small features like a slightly different depth profile for some of the divots that are cut into the side of the fan or that are on the fan blades, and slightly different changes in the outer four screw hole areas. So let's first talk about tooling, manufacturing, and molds for making different products. When we've toured a few factories in Taiwan and in China, and the thing is, ultimately, the companies make tooling, which for cases anyway, tooling consists of large pieces of steel that you use to create the chassis. For a fan, you would have tooling, you would have molds, or you would injection mold stuff, things like that. There's a tolerance, even at the same factory, one tool to the next, or one mold to the next, because they age. So the source mold or the source tool, if you're doing case tooling, eventually wears out and has to be replaced. And when you replace it, hopefully your tolerances are pretty tight, but there might be some changes, though you would hope that they're isolated to a point that you're not going to introduce some kind of issue to the product. So that's number one. That means that there can be changes even from the same factory, but maybe not as big as the one seen here. That's not to say they are big changes, but they are certainly bigger than the very small things you might see normally. The next thing to discuss is with the move from one factory to another. You're either going to be cloning tools or making them in another place, so that's a factor to account for. And then there's tooling age, so as they get used and worn down, it may be the case that one factory just happens to produce a whole lot more fans than the other, so maybe the tool made that was responsible for making the fan that was shown in the pictures was older or newer than the one next to it. So those are things to keep in mind. Next thing to keep in mind is a lot of the stuff that Noctua boasts for their fans, and all of the other fan companies too, is just kind of marketing. It doesn't really do anything of note. That's not to say the fans aren't good. They certainly do their job. But also a lot of those small features, if you were to take putty and fill in all those tiny holes on the inner frame of the fan, I would bet there'd be a pretty small difference. I'm not positive. We'll test it. But I would bet there'd be a pretty small difference. And even less so when you have the holes or the divots on each fan chassis, but one is slightly different than the other one, but they're still present. I think that's going to be a small change. Ultimately, this whole Noctua thing looks to me like it's one of the usual industry discussions that pops up every couple years, happens pretty frequently, where a manufacturer changes supplier or factory, a couple people notice, and then everyone is like, why are you selling me a product that's worse than what was originally designed? Now, sometimes that can be the case, but not always. There's a reason, for example, that Logitech doesn't talk about or confirm or disclose their supplier or source for their switches and the mice. So we can ask a question as simple as, you say you have 50 million click switches, are those Omron? And they'll say, we're not going to answer that. And as they've pointed out to me, it's not because they're trying to be difficult or because they don't know or because they think we can't find out. It's because they don't want to go on record if supply changes. And that's true for most of these companies. And that goes for fans as well. So if there's a supply side change or a factory change, they try to make it happen silently, and then theoretically, the new product should match the quality of the old one. The difference here is with Noctua, you're basically looking at color. So that's sort of annoying, yes. The color of one fan is different than the other. If you're trying to color match your system with Noctua fans, then that would be kind of annoying. But we'll see. I have some coming in. We just finally, for the first time ever, got in touch with Noctua. I'm going to try and get them to just send me a bunch of fans from each factory so we can do a large sample size test. And either I'll be wrong and there are actually large differences, or not. There might be small differences. If they won't send me a large sample size, we're also getting our own from readers, viewers, and just buying them online. So we should have samples from hopefully the official source Noctua and then retail sources. That way there's no concern of, did they just send you special samples that were painted differently or something. Okay, so I think that's enough. But basically, the Noctua thing, it seems to me like it's potentially a little overblown in terms of coverage and concern and things like that. But there could definitely be some manufacturing quality differences. Generally, moving one factory to another, you have those. It could be possible that the China or the Taiwan-based factory is producing plastics or using a mold that is, in fact, lower quality. But let's just kind of wait and we'll see what the testing shows, if any difference at all. Ultimately, the differences between them are pretty insignificant from the looks of it, but we'll find out. Next real question. So this one comes from YouTube, it looks like. I think so. It comes from Kai Du, who says, oh yeah, this was YouTube. This was on that quad GPU render machine. So this comment was kind of amusing. Kai Du said, regarding the GPUs that we had on the shelf, we have a shelf of GPUs because we use them for work, said, why don't you use them for mining? Waste of card just sitting there. So a couple things. They don't just sit there. The content that people watch on this channel does in fact require video cards. And then also, I think the definition of waste is maybe a little different between us. I wouldn't want to use cards 100% load mining and then have to use that same card for thermal testing later, because who the hell knows what kind of abuse it went through under 100% load nonstop. It may no longer represent a real user scenario, or something may burn out, or some other issue could pop up, or there's some difference between stock that makes it no longer representative, and that makes it a bad test. So no, we don't abuse the cards for mining. Played with it for a bit for that how do manufacturers feel about mining video, but that was about it. So I would not consider that a waste. As a side point, there was a comment replied to that one, I think, that I ended up deleting for a lot of reasons, but it said someone else made a comment saying that there was a certain level of arrogance of having a lot of video cards on a shelf. Just as a reminder, generally speaking, you don't walk into Lowe's or Home Depot and look around and go, wow, these people are really full of themselves. Look at all of this hardware they have here. Man, I can't shop here. There's too much arrogance coming from the drills and the hammers on the shelves. I'm gonna have to go somewhere else. So yeah, we do need the hardware for work. That's why we have it. This leads into the next question, which was, what do you do with old hardware? So pretty good transition there for once. The old hardware, I answered this in the video comments as well, but there's a few different options. So things that are smaller, GPUs, video cards, CPUs, we try to keep basically forever. or as long as is reasonable. Video cards, we're starting to run out of space for those, so that is a problem. But CPUs, we have plenty of space for, memory, plenty of space for. So we try to keep those for a few reasons. One is regression testing. So a couple examples of when we would pull an old piece of hardware off the shelf would include the i7-930 revisit, or the 2600K revisit, where you basically grab an old product and say, I wonder how this does today. And that's pretty good content. It gets good views. It's certainly worth keeping. And for something like an i7-930, just speaking very plainly, we're going to make more money on the content creation for a revisit on that than we would for selling it for 30, 50, whatever dollars it sells for these days. And also, it's just kind of cool to hang on to that stuff for other regression reasons, like what if someone discovers some major flaw or issue with these things? There were recently some hyperthreading bug discussions pertaining to older processors, and it's good to have that stuff around so that you can test it if it comes down to needing to test it. So we hang on to it for those reasons. And comparative analysis, what if company B comes out with a competitor to company C, which I'm using because those letters don't start with I, A, or N. If company B comes out with a competitor to company C's last gen mid-range product, we want to have that last gen mid-range product to make sure we can test it in modern era, new drivers at all, and see how it works. So that's what we try to do. Some stuff like cases are just impossible to keep because they're huge, and you hang on to the stuff that's either new and you might need it, or is particularly interesting. And like, for example, the NZXT S340 non-elite, that's an old case now, but I keep it because we liked it and it was very popular, so it's good to hold on to. Because what if in the future we want to do, how does today's NZXT S340 compare to whatever competitor comes out 4 or 5 years later, whatever it is. But eventually you have to get rid of cases. They're too big. So we do have a local high school that actually, we have a connection there where we donate some of the older cases to the school so they can use them for their computer engineering class. Some stuff gets sold or given to friends. But that's all pretty standard stuff, I think, for reviewers. And then the smaller stuff, CPUs we hang on to, GPUs as long as we can. What else even is there? SSDs we actually use every day in test benches, so those don't go anywhere. But I think that answers that question for the most part. The next one is a question that was for AMD. I passed it along. So Crimson asked this in some video. It was one of our Vega videos, maybe the hybrid mod or something. Crimson asked, does Vega do 10-bit OpenGL because only FirePro and Quadro cards can do it currently? NVIDIA may give you 10-bit DirectX, but no application with 10-bit support uses it. So I sent that quote to AMD, and the representative got back a couple days later and said, good news, 10-bit color is supported in OpenGL on the Vega Frontier Edition. Did not comment on RX Vega, of course, you'd expect that, but I think that answers that pretty cleanly. Next one. This is from Zeta, who is on Discord in the Patreon group. Zeta said, why isn't there a reference motherboard design like with graphics cards? Oh wait, hang on, I misread one of the words. Reference Mother Bauer design. So Zeta, we talked about this in chat, but for everyone else, this was a more popular thing to talk about a couple years ago. So if anyone remembers the Intel boards that they made, the actual Intel branded boards, they did the whole campaign that was Better Together, which I think AMD may have done as well at some point. But they basically did the whole Better Together by an Intel board with an Intel CPU thing. And some of those were more beefed up than others. But this was around the era when we last looked into this discussion of motherboard reference designs. The manufacturers did and still do supply a core spec that says the boards for this processor, this architecture, need to have an 8+4 pin, or a single 8 pin, or minimally a 4 pin, or whatever it is for EPS 12 volt. And then they also have suggestions for other component use, maybe VRM layout suggestions. They'll have the spec for the PCH or the chipset, the spec for the CPU and how many lanes it can support, and all of that goes into basically laying out, this is your max PCIe slot count that you can reasonably use, this is your max SATA slot count before you have to get your own third-party controller, and stuff like that. So there's sort of a reference design. I don't know the extent of that today. I'm actually not sure on if the board vendors still use a lot of that stuff as heavily, but when Intel made their own boards, it was more common to talk about that kind of thing or hear about that kind of thing at conventions and booths where they'd say, based on Intel's whatever reference board that they were using at the time. And this is also where you run into questions of what does Intel use, what does AMD use when they're building the CPUs, and obviously no motherboards exist yet. Generally make their own and test with those. But next question is Tao. Tao says, all the pre-built, this is YouTube, I think. Oh no, this might be Discord, I don't know anymore. All the pre-built liquid-cooled AIB partner cards I've seen are dual-slot cards with a CLC cooling the GPU and maybe the VRAM with reference-style fan cooling the VRM and other non-GPU components. Why haven't we seen single-slot AIB partner liquid-cooled cards using full-cover blocks and rad-mounted pumps, similar to what we get with the EK Predator? So I think a lot of that answer is it's cheap and relatively easy to source a CLC from Asetek or from, does anyone else even do them on GPUs? I don't know. Basically, Cooler Master or Corsair, Cooler Master, EVGA are the people who do liquid cooled. Gigabyte does as well. And the cooler for AMD, and I think last I checked for Gigabyte, came from Cooler Master. I'd have to check my own content on the, oh yeah, actually, yeah, it is Cooler Master. And then the Corsair one on MSI is an Asetek supplied cooler. EVGA's is an Asetek supplied cooler. I don't know that Coolit does anything right now in that space. But either way, it's quick and easy to throw one of those on there, cool the GPU with that, and those pumps are big, so they're not going to really fit single slot, which is the main answer to that question. As for why not get into a full cover block, well, at that point you're actually designing something, and that takes money, time, things like that. I was going to say effort, but that seems dismissive, but basically just money and time. And money and time are not something that a lot of these companies will put into a closed loop solution, because at that point you're really most of the way to an open loop solution anyway. And also you start running into having to custom design a pump or something like that unless you can source it from someone else. Asetek's not going to supply you a pump that'll work with that kind of open loop layout unless you really start going down the custom path, at which point your cost goes up a whole lot. Lead time to produce it goes up a whole lot. Maybe it's no longer relevant once it's actually done and the card is aged. But it's mostly time and money, like most things in the industry. And then at that point, you're just, again, competing with open loop anyway. And some of these companies do make open loop cards or blocks, so at that point, they're just competing with themselves. Next question is AJ Damas, who says, this is from YouTube, what happens if the PC fails, Windows error, etc., is workload saved by each frame, or must you start all over? So this is from, again, the Quad GPU video, where we were using Blender to render an animation. And the answer here is it depends how you render it. So we render in PNGs. Basically, each frame is rendered out as a single file, PNG file. They're pretty big, sometimes 30, 40 megabytes, something like that. You end up with hundreds of them or thousands of them, just depending on how long the animation is. You drop it into something like Premiere, and then create the video that way, where Premiere will just export it as an MP4 or whatever you want. You could technically render it as a video file, which I think I did once, but the problem with that is, like this user points out, if you render a video file for something that's going to take you 30 hours to render, you better hope that Windows doesn't decide to update in the middle of it, or something else like a power failure, because then you have to start over. So generally people render out single frames and then just butt them all together in some software at the end and create the video that way. But that was a good question. Next one is from Inversion, who says, why are thermal pads preferred over thermal paste? This is from Discord, for VRMs and MOSFETs on the GPU and or CPU. And is there any damage that can be caused if paste were used on the VRMs and MOSFETs instead, I guess? So Buildzoid jumped in there to talk about this one briefly, and I'm more or less going to say the same thing. A lot of it is because MOSFETs are irregularly sized and shaped. They come in all different types of sizes and heights, and general, I guess, how densely you pack the MOSFETs together. So it's just easier to put a thermal pad on there. It'll work with pretty much everything. And also the thickness matters, because thermal paste you can really only get so thick before it just doesn't really work anymore. And a lot of the time the height between the cooler and the MOSFETs is great enough that you'd want to use at least like a 0.5 or a 1.0 millimeter thermal pad or something, just because it's for sure going to make contact, and then whatever extra there is, whatever excess, it'll just compress on the surface as you apply force. So I think that's a lot of it, and probably some kind of manufacturing reasons too, but largely it's thermal paste isn't thick enough a lot of the time, and then MOSFETs are all kinds of shapes and sizes, so you just order all your thermal pads, you cut them to some base size for a PCB, and you throw them on there. And that's why a lot of the time you'll see thermal pads like bleeding over into places where there actually don't need to be any on some cards, because they have bought the thermal pads for a different design, cut them, and they just happen to fit on this one as well, so why not use it? Because it's cheaper to do that than to change your spec or change your supply or something to that effect. Next question is from TPV. This one was kind of interesting. TPV said, is there any information on how watching a YouTube video at 2 times speed affects a channel's profitability? Not sure how it's calculated. Figure it might mess with metrics. You know, I was curious about this. So the way YouTube does a lot of stuff now is watch time, and I think ad revenue ties into that as well. So with watch time, generally speaking, the longer people watch a video, the higher average watch time you have. I think with YouTube Red or something, you get a bigger share of user X's YouTube Red allowance per month. I'm not actually sure how that works. But to answer this question, my guess is if you watch it at 2 times speed and you see the whole video, I think YouTube just sees it as 10-minute video or whatever. I don't think it sees it as 5. But I'm not positive on that. I would hope and assume that it sees it based on video length and video seconds, not real seconds and real video length, because then that would just seem kind of screwy. If people are watching stuff at 2 times speed, it really suck. But I don't think that's the case. I'm pretty sure you just get paid based on the video, like actual seconds in the video consumed. Not sure though, but ultimately not a huge deal. Next question is, or last question is from Mechragon, who said, this is also on YouTube, how many people actually work at Gamers Nexus? Steve is obviously the host for the channel, and most of the articles on the website seem to be written by him. I don't know if someone else tests the hardware and he writes the articles. So who else is there besides him? A cameraman, maybe someone else to run the tests, and the cat. No hate, just honestly curious. Not sure why that would be hateful. Yeah, I host the stuff, and then we've also got Andrew does the video work. Actually, if you look in the description or the bottom of the articles, it'll have like a byline where it's got like the author and then additional reporting and testing or camera work, things like that. But Andrew does the camera and editing, a lot of it. Keegan does some of the camera and editing when we're traveling. Patrick Lathan does a lot of the benchmarking for CPUs these days. He's written a couple of the CPU reviews this year, and some of the revisits, like the i7-930 revisit article was written by him. And then we take a lot of that data and put it into the video script as well. And then Eric Hamilton helps collect news for the news recaps we do every week, and he also writes some of the articles. And then we've got a couple of Ryan helps with some of the articles as well, the weekly sales roundups on the website. Then we've got a couple of less frequent contributors. So employees, contractors, contributors are all part of the company. It's just a matter of how frequently is the stuff posted by that person, and is it a behind the scenes type of job, or is it something that's got their name on the article byline if they wrote the article. But yeah, the core team's basically Andrew, Patrick, and I'm working on stuff too. And then we've got contractors helping out with all the other stuff. So more people than it seems to be believed, I think, working on it, but still pretty small team. And I think that's all for this time. So as always, you can leave questions below. Patreon.com/GamersNexus to help us out directly. And check out our new shirts. Again, gamersnexus.squarespace.com. Links in the description below for everything else. Thank you for watching. Subscribe for more. I'll see you all next time.